Hello and welcome to The Content Advantage, a talk show about content for content people. I'm Scott Abel, and I'd like to introduce my co-host, Megan Gahuli.
Hey, Scott, how are you doing?
Good to see you. I'm doing great. Thanks for asking.
Good. So I would like to introduce somebody very special. So we know that creating an exceptional customer experience is really hard. We also know that content and design work together and they both impact a user's experience, which can kind of cause this sort of us versus them mentality between friction between content folks and UX folks. And we kind of all know that, but there is a middle ground that we can all find. And so we've invited science-based design guru Tina Kister to talk to us about how to leverage science to make content and design decisions that result in effective content experiences. So welcome to the Content Advantage, Tina.
Hi, everybody.
Good to see you.
Thank you for having me. This is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Oh, very cool. And I hear you have a couple little friends there to help you, right?
I do. I have a Chihuahua here and a Chihuahua there. So hopefully
we're going to hope we don't hear the Chihuahuas, but if we do, I'm okay with that because I'm a dog lover.
Entertainment, right? It's like a variety show. We get, instead of a comedian, we get some Chihuahuas.
Right. Yeah, we're all about the Chihuahuas. So to get us started, can you just tell us a little bit about you and how you kind of came into this idea of design-based science and how you leverage science specifically to help us make content design decisions?
Sure. So I grew up in a small town surrounded by national parks, and it was a tourist economy. And if you weren't going to serve the tourists, your only other option really was to go into science. Mm-hmm. So my dad worked for the National Park Service. My mom worked for the U.S. Geological Survey. And I spent my adolescence doing things like lying on my belly in the rain, counting plants.
Oh, wow.
So I, of course, when I hit my teenage years, rebelled and decided I never wanted to have anything to do with science again. So I went off to art school and I was able to make that work. I had a professional business making painted furniture for about 10 years and then became a mom and decided I needed to move to something a little more traditional and went back to college and got a degree in communications. And of course, my first job after I got my degree was with the U.S. Geological Survey.
Oh, interesting. Full circle.
And they didn't hire you to paint, did they?
Right.
And I realized that the reason I loved art was because it allowed me to communicate. And it was the same with the scientific information I was working with. And, 15 years later, here I am in Florida, and I've worked as a proposal manager, an instructional designer, a technical writer. I've done hundreds of presentations and on and on and on. And so I really have been able to see how science and design are related and how important design is to creating an effective information experience, and how especially one of the things that content professionals really struggle with is feeling sort of undervalued at work and having a hard time really selling what you're doing. And science-based design helps you do that with just a glance. I mean, good design, period, can do that. But when it comes to technical content and what I call high-value content, so content that companies invest a lot of money in, where there are experts who are writing and they're making sure that the language is spot on, and they may use tools that no one in the rest of the company is familiar with. It can be really hard to instantly convey the value of that. I mean, imagine, for example, there's the chief financial officer and they have to come up with a budget and decide where to allocate money, and they have to decide between the technical documentation team and the marketing team. So they go and they say, well, I'm going to look at the kind of work they've been doing. And they pull up the tech docs and they pull up the marketing docs, and they're going to have an instant visceral response to both of those. And almost certainly it's going to be biased for the marketing docs because marketing professionals spend a lot of time figuring out how to be persuasive in an instant.
And they've been open to the science argument for a while too, I think. So
yeah, more and more. It's
so
really
before we start and go any further, let's let the audience members know a few things so that they can know how to participate with us today. If you're new to the Bright Talk platform, you've not been to our webinars before, here's a few things. First, we can't see or hear you. We don't have access to your camera, so you don't have to worry about that. You can ask a question at any time using the Ask a Questions tab located in your webinar viewing panel. It allows you to text a question in. Megan and I will be responsible for checking on those every once in a while, and we may insert them into the show where relevant and time allows. At the end of the show, we'll also try to make a few minutes, if time allows, to take additional questions from the audience, so we encourage you to submit them whenever you can. There's also a section called Attachments that allows you to access information provided by both the sponsor and the presenter. There's some helpful information in case you have trouble problems with your audio or video with Bright Talk. You can also find some help there. We also will ask you to rate the show. At the end of the show, I'll remind you to do that, to give us a 1 through 5 star review. 5 is the high rating, and there's a little field there to tell Tina why you gave her the rating that you did and what you thought of her presentation. So we hope you'll do that. And today's show is sponsored by Zoom In Software. There's some information in the attachments and links section about that as well. All right, so I think that's enough to get us started here. Why don't you kick it off, Megan, and we'll see how much time we can take up with science-based information this morning.
Awesome. This is such a cool topic, and I love the introduction that you gave to yourself. It very much speaks to the right brain, left brain aspect of science-based design. And so can you just start us off to level set everyone? In your mind, what is science-based design?
Well, it's easiest for me to explain by comparing it with traditional design, and I have a few slides that I'd like to show to walk you through.
Yeah, please.
Great.
A very brief introduction. There's so much to this topic, and it's just a joy to dive into. So traditionally, when you learn design, you start with the design basics, which are the basic design elements and the basic design principles. And even on this screen here, you can see it's very common.
I don't think you're sharing.
Tina, are you sharing?
Oh.
I think you need to try one more time.
Yep, sorry.
There's a science to all of this.
There's a science.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Better.
Beautiful.
All right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So even on this screen, you can see that, that it's very common for design and art to get conflated. People often think that they're the same thing, which leads to a lot of confusion because they're not the same thing. And one of the ways to describe the difference is that art is about self-expression, whereas design is about the user response. And a lot of people ask questions like, well, isn't design completely subjective? And I think that stems in part from mixing up the two, because when the goal of art is self-expression, then the only measure of quality is whether or not one individual has successfully expressed themselves. So in that case, it is subjective. But design is about eliciting a desired response. And so it's more measurable. And design is one of those words that's very ambiguous. We use it as a verb to design things. We use it as a noun. I got to work on the design. And we use it as an idiom. This was done by design. And it's important to start out with sort of level setting the first principles. And I like to do that by defining design in the simplest terms, which is simply the arrangement of things. And this applies to both abstract things like a quality management system and concrete things like a chair. So when you learn design, you start with the principles and the elements. And the general idea is that you gain these as foundational knowledge, and then later on you can combine them into guidelines. But right away, if you've ever tried to dive into learning design on your own, right away you run into this thing where even the design basics are completely different depending on who you talk to. And this, even education systems have different design basics, and, successful commercial design enterprises. So it can be very confusing, and it's certainly not basic. And that carries over into the specifics if you dive in. So let's say we take 3 of the basic design elements: line, shape, and color. And so here's a line. That's straightforward. But the thing is, technically, a line is also a shape. And the only reason we can perceive this shape is because of a difference in color between the foreground and the background. So without that, we can't perceive anything at all. And the same ambiguity exists in the principles, where there's really no meaningful difference visually in terms of a pattern or a rhythm. And when it comes to emphasis and contrast, we often convey emphasis by increasing contrast. So trying to think of them as 2 separate things is confusing. And my favorite is how this manifests in the design guidelines, which are often really great instructions like use proper alignment and logical colors, with no clear direction on what proper and logical means. Very confusing. And I think that's why there's a lot of mystery around design and sort of what I call magical thinking, that somehow you have to be endowed with this mysterious talent. And even some designers believe that because I think they've been taught based on this traditional approach, and then they've mastered design through years of trial and error, rather than through a systematic decision-making process. So science-based design takes a different approach, and it explores these direct parallels between the way we perceive and process information and the design basics. And then it looks at how that affects our overall interpretation, inspires our behavior, and leads to success. So I'm working on a course for this right now, and the course basically follows visual stimuli from outside of the body into the eye, and then through the various pathways in the brain. And it's broken up into 2 stages: perception in the eye and perception in the brain. And I'm going to leave it there for a basic introduction because I really could go on for hours about this. And this is sort of a formal definition that science-based design is an interdisciplinary framework for making decisions about information development based on the science of how human beings perceive and process information. And I just want to throw out there that it includes 3 main components: a body of knowledge, which is the science; a paradigm, which is a new way of thinking about information development and decision making; and a methodology, which is the step-by-step guidelines that follow from the first 2.
Interesting.
That was great information. Thank you for sharing that. Why should our audience care about science-based designs? What kind of benefit do you see taking this approach, providing the information development professional?
Well, one of the main tenets of what I call information development is that there's 3 components of high quality information. It has to enable success in the user, it has to enable success for the organization, and it has to enable success for the information developer. And balancing all 3 of those things can get tricky. For the information developer, it has several great benefits. One is one I started talking about before, which is that visceral immediate response, which is so powerful. And it's a great way to convince people. I mean, you can talk all day long about, the rods and the cones and cognitive bias and framing and all of this sciencey stuff. Nothing is going to convince people more than just putting the product in front of them and saying, this is without science-based design and this is with it.
Yeah.
And that's just the way to go. It also makes your job as an information developer easier, because the same information processing mechanisms that our users experience, we experience. So it, identifies, say you're scrolling through a long, complex document and you're looking for a section. To use a very simple example, if you're a user and you're looking for a piece of information, having great headings is going to make that a lot easier. If you're a writer and you need to revise a certain piece of information, the same thing applies.
Yeah, so the benefits are not just external to the customer that you're working for. It's also for the organization that you're serving.
Absolutely.
People who work there. The frustration level must come down a lot when people start to better understand how they communicate on teams, for example. So I think science-based design does play a great role there.
Yeah.
Hey,
Sure.
Tina, you brought up cognitive bias, and we know that cognitive bias can come from anything related to our experiences, our political affiliations, our race, all of these things come in. But one of the biggest, I guess, cognitive biases that we don't really think of as biases is just different cultures and different locales. For example, the way I see red might be different than the way they see red in China, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
how does science-based design, how do these decisions sort of hold true across these different cultures and locales?
Well, I'd like to answer that question in two parts. First of all, by talking about the term cognitive bias. In my research, there's a whole branch of exploration of the mechanisms we normally call cognitive bias, and they refer to them simply as heuristics, because bias is such a negative word. And the truth is, these mental shortcuts that we use to make snap judgments are fantastic. They ensure our survival. They allow us to act quickly. And in fact, our brain is hardwired so that we can have reflexive responses. So let's say a baseball is sailing at you. Yeah. You don't want to have to consciously process that and then decide to put your hand up to block it. So the visual stimuli actually gets routed into two different pathways. One that processes location information and threat information so we can respond instantly. And then the other one that goes, ultimately to our frontal cortex and uses executive functions. And I'd like to talk a little bit more. This is great that you brought up the color red. And I have a little presentation that not only will talk about our response to red, but also kind of give you a peek into what the course is shaping up to look like.
Great.
Nice. And just so everyone knows, I don't consider bias to be a negative. I know that we've learned, because of our cognitive biases, we've learned that bias can be negative. But I like to think of biases as just things that are out there that impact us.
Okay. Right. So this is just a little mini example. I just finished this a second ago, so let's hope I can make it work smoothly. So like you mentioned, the color red can mean extremely different things in different cultures. Although interestingly, if you look at this image, weddings are really important individual and societal sort of, what do you call that? Milestone in many cultures. And in the US, if we want to evoke a wedding, we use white. But in India, if you want to evoke a wedding, we use red. But the underlying sort of emotions that we're evoking are the same. So we're evoking transformation, fertility, celebration. So this is actually a great testament to why it's still important to really know your audience, because framing and priming are two technical terms in perception studies. And you really want to play on what people bring to their interaction with your content based on their long-term memory and their past experiences. You don't want to have to force new visual cues on them. So knowing your audience is still important, and that is fundamental to the paradigm of science-based design. But even before we get to that, that sort of cultural learned response is our physiological response. So this is probably a bit of review, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. When light enters your eye, it is focused on an area at the back of the eye called the retina. And the retina has photoreceptor cells on it. And the two main types of photoreceptors are called rods and cones. And rods facilitate vision in low light conditions, and cones facilitate vision in normal light conditions. And cones are the only photoreceptor that allow us to perceive detail and color. And of course, there are three types of cone cells. We call them red, green, and blue, but they're actually cells that are sensitive to red, green, and blue wavelengths of light. So on the back of the retina, in the middle of the retina, there's a tiny little area called the fovea. And it's so small, it's only about 1% of the retina. And there's a much higher concentration of cone cells in the fovea. So this graph, the green represents cones and the blue represents rods. And right here in the middle is the fovea. And you can see that there are almost no rods. And the concentration of cones skyrockets. And the implications of this are fascinating. And there's tons of them for design. So it means that in reality, even though we perceive the world around us as a sort of a seamless picture of equal detail, most of what we see in our field of view is blurry. And there's just a tiny little area that is high resolution detail. And this area is about as big as your thumbnail if you hold your thumb up at arm's length. So our eyes, to compensate for this, are constantly moving in these abrupt little involuntary movements called saccades. And that allows us to collect these little high resolution snapshots, which our mind stitches together into the perceived whole. But the distribution of rods and cones isn't the only thing that affects how we engage with our field of view. It also has to do with the distribution of cones within the fovea. So there are way more red sensitive cones than blue sensitive cones. And interestingly, our response to red wavelengths of light is actually higher than to blue. So we're more sensitive to red. So when you combine this sensitivity with the frequency of the number of cone types, you get curves that look like this. So that essentially our physiological response to red is heightened compared to blue. And this is consistent with sort of the standard psychological meanings of colors. So when you're working on content and let's say you have to make a decision about warnings, cautions, and notes, one of the most important things in science-based design is called congruent meaning, where you want to make sure that the design decisions you make reinforce your meaning. So obviously warnings are, we want people to have a heightened response and pay attention and read those and change their behavior based on them. So you can make them red. And cautions are important, but not as important. So those might be green, which is this intermediate response. And then notes could be blue, which just means, this is not the body text. You should read it, but you don't have to. It's not as important. But interestingly, in most cultures, certainly in our culture, there's the paradigm of the traffic light colors, red, yellow, and green. So it might be just as effective to use traffic light colors here, in which correlates, creates a sense of congruent meaning, because when someone sees a warning, you want them to stop. When someone sees a caution, you want them to slow down. It's a little less congruent with the green because a note doesn't mean go for it. But you've got that familiarity factor that triggers an instant response. So the lesson is that really either one of these color schemes is okay. And for the first one, you don't need to know anything about your user's cognitive bias.
That's really interesting. So that really lays out the difference between what we know physiologically versus what we've learned. Like the stoplights. We've learned what red means. We've learned what yellow means and what green means. But you're saying that physiologically, even if we went red, green, blue, we would have a similar response. We just would take out the learned response of stop versus go. It would be more of a heightened response of some sort to a lesser response.
Right.
Super interesting.
That's
very cool.
This is a great opportunity for us to take just a short break and say, because we are doing this, we are trying to create the best customer experiences possible, often with a bunch of content that comes from different people who are well-intentioned, but aren't able to bring it all together. Megan works for a company called Zoom In Software. That's our sponsor today. Megan, could you tell us a little bit about what Zoom In does?
Absolutely. So Zoom In helps customers find the answers they need while empowering agents to deliver better support. And we do that by, as you say, bringing in content from multiple locations and pushing the same content out to multiple touch points with a very consistent, unified, personalized experience.
Excellent. You can learn more about Zoom In Software by visiting them on the web at zoominsoftware.com. There's also some information available in the attachments section of your webinar viewing panel that I encourage you to check out. There's a document you can download, some links you can click on and find out more about Zoom In Software. So you had really got me thinking, Tina, about warnings, cautions, and notes, because they're so important and they're different. But sometimes they're confused just because of the example you gave earlier with colors and other perceptive things. But sometimes readers overlook them anyway, right? It's kind of the nature of the beast, right? We're in a hurry. We're looking for the quick answer. We want you to help us, but we don't want to spend time in a college course just to get an answer. So how do we make sure that these important types of content are noticeable and that they actually jump out in the way that we want them to?
Well, obviously, I mean, in that example I just showed you, color is a really important one. More than any particular characteristic is a concept called saliency, which means the degree of difference between things on the page. And it's one of the things that makes it so hard in the traditional approach to teach design, because you can't, no one can say, you know, what font should I use? And someone can answer you, because it's about the degree of difference. So it's really important when working with complex documents to start with your body text. And you want to make sure that it's legible and readable, that, you know, and to ensure organizational success, you want to make sure that the font's available. So there's certain criteria that you want. And if you start with that body text, and the reason you start with the body text is because presumably it contains the meat of your information.
Right, yeah, of course.
It contains the most nuanced and complex information. It's also the hardest to process. Reading is not natural. And we're so proficient at it that we forget that. But it takes years to learn. So there are a lot.
Right, and energy to do.
And effort, yeah. So you don't want to force people to read when you don't have to. And there's nothing wrong with that. I get really tired of this whole trend in the media that somehow our attention spans are shrinking and we're getting dumber. It's like, no, we're relying more and more on information and content. And so, you know, we have less and less time to deal with poorly developed information.
And before Megan asks the question, I know she's dying to ask you, because we talked about this earlier. So I wanted to give our audience member a question opportunity. However, I want to rephrase the question based on what you just said. Originally, the question was basically, tell me what fonts and colors and sizes. So I want to ask you the question, is there such a thing as a standard set of fonts, colors, sizing, and spacing recommendations that lead to better response to written knowledge article, for example?
No. I mean, the short answer is no, because like I said, it all starts with your body text. Now, what you can do is you can tell me what genre and media you're using. So if it's web design, I can say, well, for a standard font, you might start by trying 16-point Arial.
Right.
But that's just a starting point, because fonts vary depending on, the size of them varies depending on what font you choose. So even that is just the most basic starting point. And it depends on the meaning of your content as well. The complexity of it, the types of headings you're using. There's a great myth that floating around that somehow you can separate content and design, and it's just not possible. Do we have time for me to show you a quick?
Yeah, just for the audience members, we've allotted a few extra minutes for Tina's show today. So if you were expecting the show to end in 30 minutes, you're probably already noticing it's 31 minutes. You can return back to the same URL you're using to watch this live show. About 30 minutes from now, it will turn into a recording, so you won't miss any of the show. Yes, Tina, go ahead. Let's see what you got.
Okay, I'll just cut to the chase on this one. So this is a little experiment I developed. Whoops, I forgot to share my screen. Share. This is a little experiment to sort of demonstrate the problem with the whole concept of content versus design. So if we have information deliverable here, and let's say we define content as text, which is most commonly what it means. Although, like the word design, it's has a lot of ambiguity. But let's define content as anything having to do with writing, and let's take it away. And that leaves us with a bunch of shapes and colors that don't convey any actionable meaning at all. And on the other hand, if you remove all of the design elements, so anything that you might consider design choice, font, colors, white space, you end up with a block of text. And it's incomprehensible, but guess what? It's still a font in a block in a position on the page. So it's still using the basics of design in order for you to be able to perceive it. So there's what I call the content equation, and this is absolutely essential to understand this for science-based design, that content is actually made up of language, which in a physiological sense, neurologically, we process language as a phonetic phenomenon. It has to do with our ears. And then design, which is visual, and then ideas, which are the concepts we're trying to convey. And these are all very enmeshed. You can't convey or even think about ideas without language. And but the point of all of them together is to make a claim or assert an argument in the rhetorical sense, the classic rhetorical sense of an argument. So all information is inherently persuasive, even if the only claim that's being made is this is credible. But this is a sort of the new paradigm for understanding how content and design, what they actually are and how they interact.
That's super interesting, and it makes me think about accessibility a little bit, right? Because I have a third grade daughter who has developmental delays, and the auditory part of her brain does not function. So she needs to learn in a very different way, and she needs to see things. On the flip side, there are people who are colorblind. So if you're creating pictures that are telling them red, yellow, green, or red, green, blue, whatever that color scheme is, they might not be perceiving the red different from the blue. So how do we think about these things when we're creating our style guides? How do we create rules that are science-based design, but also take into account the fact that we have these accessibility issues for people who are maybe different than average?
Well, again, I have a two-part answer to that. One is to understand that all content is visual. So, aside from like if you're doing a podcast, but even if you're delivering a video or a webinar like this one, you're interacting with it usually on a computer screen and in a visual way. So when you understand that, then as a writer, for example, or a technical communication professional, which I identify as, but I'm constantly frustrated by how much design is neglected in this field.
Yeah, agree.
But when you understand that writing is the visual expression of language, and when you write, you're essentially engaging in an act of design. So you might as well become aware of what you're doing so you can control it. And having that sense of that you're manipulating not just language, but also visual stimuli can empower you to help people better you become more aware of your own response. You can learn more about their response. And then in a more practical way, for the question of color blindness, the best thing you can do is what is called double cueing. So when I was talking earlier about those warnings, cautions, and notes, I showed little icons and they were in gray. But because of the shape and the internal glyph, you were able to differentiate between them. And then I add color, and that adds a second visual cue. So that's one way you can deal with things like color blindness.
I've also seen this was for a company that knew their audience very well, first of all. So they were very particular about offering up an option. And I don't know if this is addressing exactly what you're talking about, but I think it is. There was a button there that allowed people who had vision problems, for example, to increase the font size on their page without doing it through the browser. It was actually in the application they were using. But there was also another button that said change contrast, which I thought was interesting, that they actually knew that someone might need that.
Yeah.
Is that where we're going, to try to figure out, if you can't make it perfect for everyone, how can we accommodate the biggest group of people and then make options for the others who need special accommodations?
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is outside the realm directly of science-based design, because you're talking about technology. You're talking about, technology solutions. But there are things like I was talking about double queuing, where you can make it more accessible, if not ultimately accessible.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Perfect. Well, let me tell you that you've got some products that you can definitely generate from these. My little entrepreneurial brain started clicking about twice during the show today that you should create some science-based design templates because I started recognizing that image that you just last showed that looked like an executive summary of something looked like one of those standard, you can buy these pre-designed templates and just put your content in, and then it will be fabulous, right? And it might fit the container that they gave you, but it may not achieve the goal that you wanted. So you maybe have a design idea there for business. Also, science-based style guide design seems like a really smart thing, because I've participated on these style guide things, and it becomes a matter of who thinks something's more important than another, and it seldom is science. It's usually something that they learned earlier in their life, and it's just stuck with them, and that's become the rule. So I encourage you to take your science-based design thinking and use your entrepreneurial spirit to figure out where you might be able to offer some value, because I think it's extremely important what you've been doing.
Sounds like a good idea. That sounds like a really good idea.
Do we have another minute? Because I actually have a couple more slides about.
I've got a question for you as well from the audience. And if any other audience members have one, we still have a couple minutes. You can chime in right now using the questions feature on your webinar viewing panel.
Can you see my screen, okay? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, so this is part of the paradigm too, which is so important. And it's an interesting shift because anyway, I'll just go through the slides and then I can answer questions about it. But it really started with the difficulty that I have in answering the question, what do you do? Because there's really no good answer. And even though we live in an age of information, where information is so important that there are dozens and maybe hundreds of specialized information development jobs out there, we are living under this old paradigm where everything is siloed by field, genre, and media. And I use this metaphor of an umbrella because for each of these sort of silos, our particular training and education comes with all of these assumptions that include values, goals, specific conventions, and the tools that we use. And it's really based on this outdated way of developing information that was appropriate from the time that the printing press was in widespread use to the time the internet became in widespread use, but it's really just not appropriate anymore. And one of the examples I like to give is in the modern age, you might have to sell and promote a technical manual about something in the arts and entertainment field, like ballet, which is a real thing. You know, it happens all the time where you have to cross these genres and fields and media. So information development is a new paradigm where everything that's common to all of these specialized forms of information development can be moved up so we can share the knowledge and share the values, which essentially are the same. We all want to create information that is easy to find, read, understand, use, and remember. No matter what your other goals are, that's sort of the crux of it. And in the old paradigm, you must have specific subject knowledge, create content in a specific style, use specific tools, and know your specific audience. But in the modern paradigm, you must be able to gain specific subject knowledge, tailor content to a specific style, master specific tools, and customize your content for any audience. So the core components of information aren't changing, but the way we approach them really needs to.
I couldn't agree more.
That's my little paradigm speech.
Yeah. Very nice. I like it.
I'm very happy. All my cells are firing, and it's
yes.
Neurons, I think, are jumping around. One of our viewers said they found it an interesting exercise when you took away the words from the design, and I think that is compelling. And they asked, are there design elements or recommendations for designing based on the desired outcome for the reader? For example, if the content is to encourage adoption, like to try out a new product, or to self-solve an issue, would you do something very specific to try to get that outcome?
Yes. So my area of specialty is more problem solving than like sales kind of stuff.
Sure.
I have issues with the whole value system behind sales and marketing.
Oh, that sounds like a whole nother webinar.
It is. It's interesting. Being persuasive and compelling is not one of my issues. Definitely I'm on board with that. So, and that makes me think of one of the most important things about making decisions of science-based design, which is that our perception is altered and tainted by our goals. So I was talking to someone a little while ago who said, I don't read headings. I just read body text. And that's
I think that was me.
Yeah, I think that was and part of that is because we all perceive things categorically. So that and this starts in the eye and goes all the way to the brain. So that we put things in categories, and the primary categories are relevant and irrelevant, and that is shaped by your goals. And when we put something in the irrelevant category, we literally become blind to it.
It's like your mailbox, right? If you open the mailbox today and you get a lot of political mail from some entities, and then some sales materials from other entities, and then some potentially customized mail to you from people that you know or entities you deal with, you do kind of sort them into stacks. Like, this is something I'm going to deal with, and this is junk mail, and there are multiple kinds. And you're right, it's that irrelevance that triggers it. It's like, that's not important to me.
Right. My husband,
I think it actually goes to, like, my husband actually fixes houses, and so we're constantly in a flux of living in some sort of construction, and I become blind to it. But people come in our house, like my father-in-law comes in, and it drives him crazy. He's like, why is that baseboard not on yet? Why is that door handle not there? Whatever it is. And I'm like, we just haven't gotten there yet, right? Yeah. But I'm blind to it. Yeah.
But a classic example, to go back to the question, my husband loves to cook, and this weekend he went to look up a recipe, and nothing that drives him crazier than this standard in the cooking world now, where you look up a recipe and you have to scroll through anecdote after anecdote.
Right.
You know, and he just wants the recipe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, obviously that's based on goals. That convention of presenting recipes that way, give them the benefit of the doubt rather than saying they're trying to make you stay on the page and accidentally click on an ad, is that they have developed a following where they actually have a more personal relationship with their readers. And my husband sort of plunking himself into this relationship and hoping to get the recipe and move on. So the content isn't actually made for him. Again, that's giving them the benefit of the doubt. But that, you know, maybe that gives some kind of clue in how you make different decisions based on what your users' goals are.
I think you're right. And I think that's a good place to leave it today. Unless, Megan, you have a last minute question?
No, I think we're good. This has been really interesting. Just the right level of geekiness for me. I really love it. Yeah.
My
Yeah.
geekometer is going wild.
Yeah, totally. Love it.
Thank you for sharing that, Tina. Thank you to the audience member for submitting questions and for being here and attentive. We'd like to thank you for coming to our show. So thanks so much. And thanks, Megan, for co-hosting with me.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me. And if anyone has any questions, please reach out to me. You can find my email address on the internet. Looking at the attachments should give it to you.
Very good. And so thank you, Tina, for being here. This was super fun. To the audience, just so you know, before you sign off, we want you to go down to the bottom of your bar there, use the Rate This tab, and give us a 1 to 5 star rating to let us know how we did and how you liked today's show.
Excellent. Yeah, please do. And leave a little comment to let Tina know. I know that she loves to hear feedback, especially anything that can help her do a better job the next time, because science. So thank you to the audience members. And don't forget that we have a show every 2 weeks. So you'll be receiving an invitation to attend our next show, which is Tuesday, October the 27th. We have another great guest. This time we're bringing content operations specialist and technical communication guru Rahel Bailey to come and talk to us about the past, the present, and the future of content strategy. She did a lot of work to kind of document the history of our professions and how we all interrelate together. And she's got some thoughts for the future that you don't want to miss. So thanks so much for joining us today. Look for an invitation to that show, and be safe. Keep doing great work, and we'll see you on the next the Content Advantage talk show. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Ensure your customers find the answers they need with Zoomin. Bring together product content from all teams and sources to deliver a unified, personalized content experience. Check us out at www.zoominsoftware.com.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.